It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I notice many of your distinguished participants, Kabesi, our good friend who is always very supportive of us, the Kabesi of Okela. Thanks for joining us, and many other distinguished speakers. The connection with all of us to Ife has been very deep and profound. And in my own case, I went to school there. I live in the city. And those of us who are at Ife, in those days, the university was very sincere in its connections with the city and its history. So the town and gown was very well developed. Some of you will remember that Ife was bringing notable creatives and historians to campus. And there were memorable events. Professor Akinjogbe organized a conference when Kabiyesi Olubushe was made king. It's subsequently published as an edited book. And Professor Eluyemi, who was a right-hand man of Kabiyesi Olubushe, so many of you who remember, was doing that linkage. And one of the memorable events was when Ife gave honorary doctorate to Baba Fabumi, an event that I witnessed in its pomp and majesty. So the history department at Ife was dedicated under the leadership of Professor Akinjogbe, a Yoruba patriot, a Yoruba nationalist, and a committed historian of the Yoruba people, to understanding the history of Ife. Two notable essays of that moment. By the way, I'm not reading the lecture because I don't read my lectures. I speak to my lecture. Two memorable events, two memorable essays, in addition to many others, came out of Ife History Department. One by Professor Akinjogbe and one by Professor Olomola, mapping out what they call Ife before Oduduwa. These essays require being reprinted. I want to suggest as part of the outcome of this conference. In the essay by Professor Akinjogbe using the Kedu, and that essay has never been followed up by anyone. His argument was that there's an ancient language which he collected, and I attended the seminar where it was presented, but it was not subsequently published. If I search my library, I have the essay, and I'm sure some of you have the essay, and we should get the permission of his family to print and circulate the essay. And I will tell you in a moment why it's important to do that. The other one by Professor Olomola was Ife before Oduduwa. Both essays were complicated by Adeobayemi in a seminar that he presented at Ife. How many Ife? How many Ile-Ife? And he identified many of them. The reason why we need to republish these essays arise from the controversies between the Olugbo and the recent statement by the palace stating that that reference to Ile-Ife means Igbo people in eastern Nigeria. Our evidence in the 80s and 70s was not referring to the Igbo people. If it refers to the Igbo people, we need more evidence. If it is the Igbo, in relation to the Moremi story, we're on firmer ground. If we were on firmer ground, and I don't want to offend the Kabesi who is here, is to return to the older model of how the Yoruba people allocated knowledge. And here's what they did. they allocated Asha, what the English people call culture, in all its narrowness, and sometimes what they call traditions, to the kings. And they allocated history, what we call Itan, to the specialists. And Oyo was very categorical about that, creating that specialization. One outcome of this conference, because you can't spend resources, bring people together, and you do not say, this is the outcome of why we gather. One outcome of this conference could be to return to that model of old Oyo Empire. Who keeps traditions? Who keeps history? Who keeps king list? Because if we don't do it that well, we have situations like statements coming from the Luo and some recent statements that may put us in some kind of contestation. So I've suggested two outcomes for this conference. As to the paper itself, which I've released to Professor Shinya Oyeweso, the concept of royalty and the royal dynasty must be located in a long history dating back to Pharaonic Egypt, where many of these ideas emerged, traveled long distances, and got their coloration in different locations. We have to see it as a contribution to what I call the mental fact of civilization. That when you see the crown and the ruke, these are symbolism. Those are artifacts. The palace is an artifact. But what you do not see is the mental facts, the idea that gave birth to them. So that as we study those artifacts and the symbols, Professor Oyeweso was referring to various studies on palaces. We have to also talk about the ideas behind them. And when you talk about the royal dynasty, we have to see it as a complex in which the king, in this case the Oni, was at the apex of power. But that power, you have to see it in the metaphor of a tree with its roots, with its branches, with its stem, in which there are various components of it. And to those who have studied Ile-Ife, they've identified many of its components, so that we can approach this topic from its significant historical aspects. We can approach it from its cultural aspects, which many of the people are speaking to. Whether you go via history, we can argue, or you go via culture, we can also argue. The evidence is clear that there was a solid foundation. And that solid foundation, as Ogundran spelled out, is before 1000 AD, which means we're dealing with centuries and centuries of history. In those centuries of history, we find evidence of historical governance. Historical governance. And I'm using that phrase to indicate the rise of institutions, the efficiency of institutions, and the endurance of institutions. Check modern Nigeria from 1960 to present. You could see instability. You could see a wide range of ruptures. But in the case of Ife that I'm talking about, that historical governance has tremendous depth and endurance. And one outcome is for us to look for someone, just as Ogundiran did for the Yoruba, to map out the timeline in its concreteness. We've been able to map out timeline for 2 dynasties in African history. The Solomon dynasty in Ethiopia and the Sefawa dynasty that lasted 771 years until it was overthrown by the Shehu. Someone has to do a research mapping out this timeline in its various changes and contours, because we know it has endured for centuries. That endurance brought many advantages. In an essay by the philosopher, which you call Ife, the T-junction, an essay that we should also reprint as part of the outcome of this conference by Robin Orton. It was such an elaborate essay. I do not know why it's not cited and cited over and over again, in which it locates Ife in a similar way that we locate Mali in the trans-Saharan trade. It located Ife at the junction of an extensive regional trade. If we're able to republish this essay, it will push our understanding further. That this historical governance was also generating, first, regional stability, in spite of the fact that other kingdoms like Ile-Ife arose, or Oyo Empire arose. That regional stability was not disrupted until the last 9 years of the 18th century. And we have to study why. Second, how that governance provided an extensive regional commerce that no one, up until today, is yet to study. I'm suggesting many topics now to move this conversation forward. We have archaeological evidence, and more have been done, and more will be done, that has dated that historical governance to 4th century BC. In other words, we have to push this date further and further and further, so that the AD date, as good as it is, may even be undermining that history, because it's longer than that. And as we check the data we have from archaeology, we begin to see Ile-Ife's prominence in its distinction as an ancestral homeland. Mythology has confirmed that, and archaeology has pushed the date further than what we are currently working with. Professor Akinjogbe is very definitive in his own assertion that the heart of Ile-Ife's origin is the descent of Oduduwa. He didn't say it began with Oduduwa. It was very clear, and I don't want to misrepresent him. He said it was before Oduduwa, and in this essay, I use the concept of the Ogboni leaders. And I hold it to Baba Fabumi in an interview. When I said, what should we call them? Notice in Olomola's essay, he was struggling for a name. And notice in Professor Akinjogbe's essay, he was also struggling for a name to call the pre-Oduduwa kings. But by the time in Professor Akinjogbe's excellent analysis, by the time we confront Oduduwa, what Professor Akinjogbe's data revealed was a well-established monarchy. And archaeologists have added to Professor Akinjogbe's essay based on mythology references to an ancient city wall made of artworks. I think with more funding, since part of that city wall has been located, it should be possible for us to actually begin to trace that artworks and begin to relate it to the Benin wall that we know and the Jebu wall, city wall that we know. As to the royal dynasty itself as it emerged, we must commend it for the preservation of what I will call an unbroken Yoruba tradition, an unbroken Yoruba tradition, transcending written historical documentation. That tradition has transcended written historical documentation. And in that documentation, archaeological, written, oral, the consistency is that they all maintains a prominent presence, a prominent presence. And please notice my phrase, prominent presence. Because to people like Professor Yewes or Professor Additional who is here, who have been heads of department, they will appreciate the concept of prominent presence. Because you can head an institution and not have a prominent presence. Even in modern governance, in the first 8 months of his presidency, Buhari did not have a prominent presence. In addition to that prominent presence, it is clear from all the data that they only exercise considerable influence. This considerable influence, by the time Johnson began to map it out, he began to see it in a spiritual essence, which is correct. There's no doubt about that. And if you even look at the cognomen, it kept referring to that spiritual presence. But here is where we have to broaden the data beyond that of Johnson. If you return to Orton's essay, that T-junction thesis, notice how Ile-Ife became a major central figure in a complex trading network. Now, you can't have that T-junction essay by limiting our need to the spiritual influence. It has to be more than that. It has to be more than that. So here is yet another work we have to do. How is that political influence, how was it mapped out? How was that economic influence mapped out? In many contributions to Oni's power, it is a referential component, the power of the presence and the power of rituals that they emphasize. But I'm suggesting this afternoon that we have to broaden this. As to the cultural influence, and before I move that, can I please confirm that people are hearing what I'm saying? Are you hearing me? There's no answer. Are you hearing me?
We can hear you, sir. We can hear you clearly, sir.
I just want to make sure that people are hearing me. That in terms of the cultural influence, the royal dynasty exercised cultural influence in so many ways: traditions, ceremonies, festivals, rituals. And this month, you've seen the display of many of these. And people have been studying these ceremonies and festivals and the rituals. As you can see today in the celebration of the ongoing, of the recently concluded festival and the crown. And we can find the dynasty's influence through contributions in the area of creatives and culture, sculptures, bronze. I need not spend your valuable time on these aspects that are already well known. But we can say that we are yet to fully engage in scholarship of the historicization of ideas behind all these masterpieces. We've been able to point to their artistic prowess, their cultural primacy, and their skill workmanship. But we need to do more work on epistemology. We've also seen the attempts by the royal dynasty to engage in what I call cultural diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy. In that cultural diplomacy, we have to thank the Obafemi Awolowo University under Wande Abimbola for opening a Yoruba house in Brazil, for sending Ife students to Brazil. And that cultural diplomacy has continued. Olubushi went to Cuba, he went to Brazil. The Onias last year was in Brazil. And that cultural diplomacy, we have to continue with it and contribute to the project of developing that cultural diplomacy. I was told by Professor Adisa that a project is underway at Ife to create a unit of tourism in relation to many of these ideas. I don't know where they want to locate it, but irrespective of where they locate it, it will enhance the place of the royalty, the place of Ife, the place of Obafemi Awolowo University in tourism and cultural diplomacy. I've been talking so far on Ife, not just as an important geographical entity, but as a reservoir of cultural customs, very well demonstrated, a hub of profound knowledge in its organic historic dimension and in extension to the cumulative body of work and research carried out at the Obafemi Awolowo University. And Ife is also a testament to the enduring heritage of the Yoruba community. We have to be proud of it. We are not boasting about that pride enough, and it is time to boast about it. I've also pointed that primarily the royal dynasty in Ile-Ife exemplifies the preservation of tradition. The lineage of the monarchy remains unbroken, tracing its origin back to the mythical Oduduwa, but we still have not created a timeline and trace the major phases in that timeline. This genealogical heritage transcends historical documentation, and we should be very clear that it transcends historical documentation. It stands as a vibrant manifestation of the ancestral connections that link the entire Yoruba race to their origins. And in that capacity, the Ooni of Ife remains the preeminent sovereign within an ancestral lineage, and he holds a position of profound spiritual and cultural significance. And Yoruba cosmology has been very clear in spelling out the role of the Ooni in his multifaceted role, including political leadership, sacred responsibility, safeguarding the Yoruba pantheon of divine entities, and what I would call safeguarding ancestral spirits. Ancestral spirits. And in that ancestral spirit, you see the ideas of Isheshe that people are trying to revive. And the dual nature of the monarch's role serves to underscore the belief that the monarch functions as a defined emissary. Now I'm using emissary carefully, establishing a connection between the mortal plane and the ethereal realm. And this enduring belief system has been there for centuries. And in the realm of governance, the Oni wields influence. And the dynasty assumes important role. The historical context surrounding the royal dynasty is a complex tapestry we should all continue to support. Let me now move to the contemporary influence. And I want to start with an unfortunate episode by Obasanjo. And to those of you who read my media pieces, I wrote a piece on Obasanjo, Obadide, Obajoko, where I had to condemn the president, a Yoruba man, for that unfortunate behavior. He has not apologized, which is also unfortunate. But you could see how upset our people were. He went too far. He shouldn't have done what he did. And you and I, we should also use this conference. When you are drafting the communique, I do not know the language you are going to use to condemn that kind of practice. You should condemn it. This conference, Kabe Siwu is here with us. Part of this communique must condemn what the president did. You may not mention his name for political reason. And we have to insist in writing the communique from this conference that we should not be disrespectful of our kings. One or two of you may know that when we were not happy with a king, we sent a delegation to him. I was part of that delegation. And part of what we can do in writing this communique is to say that if we are not happy, we should create a citizen pressure group to lead delegation to the kings that we are not happy with, instead of what Obasanjo did, embarrassing them in public. Present-day impact of Ife Royal's dynasty continue to show relevance to tradition. And we can see this in cultural diplomacy. I will soon finish because I'm hearing a voice that is saying I'm spending more time. I will soon complete this. We could see this in philanthropic pursuits, which the ONU is doing now. We could see this in community development, recently announced loans to people. That's commendable. So other citizens can join. We could see it in commitments to communal well-being, development of socio-economic progress, conflict management, and promotion of peace. We do not want war among the Yoruba people. We do not want war in our cities. We do not want what happened to Modernity and Ile-Ife, in which the city was destroyed. We want peace. And we've seen what the current dynasty is doing for the pursuit of knowledge. We have our challenges. How do we transform traditional institutions in the context of contemporary governance? If I held a seminar on that under Aborishade, the communique remains that we can recirculate. What about economic challenges, which give traditional leaders powers of responsibility for modern development initiative, which is meant for government but without resources? The Kabiyesi of Okela is here, who has a school. That is a function of a government, but without the finances of a government. That's a challenge. How do we support initiatives like that? How do we support advancement of economic development? One Kabiyesi told me that the citizens of his town who have no jobs come to him in a large number. He doesn't have a government of his own. He does not have a business of his own. He relies on you and I. How do we assist our kings to be part of the economic agenda of the modern nation state? How do we utilize technology to preserve cultural tradition? Professor Ogen of Osun State University has a UNESCO grant to do this aspect, digitizing cultural tradition. And the more we digitize them, the more we showcase them, the better for us. And how do we involve the community in meaningful dialogue, opening channels of communication among diverse people? And let me conclude by saying that the royal dynasty has exemplified what I call cultural fortitude and flexibility. Cultural fortitude and flexibility. The Oni has to continue with what I call that cultural fortitude and flexibility. And both have to be connected to the discourse on the interplay between tradition and modernity, culture and development. We cannot talk about tradition today now without talking about its modernity. And we cannot talk about culture without talking about development. We realize, as I've said in this paper, that the origins of the dynasty can be traced both to mythical and historical antecedents. And the historical context of the dynasty underscores its significance. The royal family, we should thank them, has successfully adapted to contemporary social demands by assuming multifaceted roles as our cultural ambassadors, cultural envoys, benefactors of charitable causes, catalysts for community advancement. Their sphere of influence extends to politics, governance, intricate art of conflict resolution. The Oni and the royal dynasty uphold their role as guardians of culture, guardians of tradition, and they are promoting the dissemination of Yoruba heritage on a global scale. We have to support what they are doing, and they also have to support what you and I are doing. talk about the future, I've pointed out the challenges. The significance of the dynasty is of paramount importance. It has the potential to reconcile tradition and modernity, to be part of the development effort. For the organizers of this conference, we cannot thank you enough. We anticipate your communique that will speak to many of these issues. And KBC, who is here, those who are not here, we appreciate the enduring legacy of Yoruba culture, entrenched in our rich traditions, which we must promote in the contemporary era, so that we continue to guarantee the vitality and relevance of our collective heritage for future generations. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.